And we're back for video 2. So we've covered the first government called the Articles of Confederation and why it failed. Now we're jumping into what you're probably more familiar with, which is the Constitution. So after they realized the Articles were crappy and they needed to change, they then decided to get together in Philadelphia at what is now known as Independence Hall in 1787. And it was during that summer. I believe they started in May and ended in September. George Washington was the leader of this meeting. He was not the president yet because the Articles of Confederation did not establish an executive branch, and they didn't have a president. So after this meeting, he would then become the president. The biggest thing you need to know about the Constitution is the compromises that were made at it. So, first thing they had to figure out is how to handle the legislative branch. How should they structure the power here in regards to population? And should they even think about population at all when it comes to the legislative branch? Well, the delegates from Virginia came in with what became known now as the Virginia Plan, which is where they said they should have a bicameral legislature, which is what we have today, which should be based on the population of each state. Lower house voted in by the people, and how many seats in that house a state had depending on its population. And those people in the lower house would then choose an upper house. And obviously the bigger states would probably choose people to fill that upper house, which eventually would kind of become the Senate, but they would choose people who had the interest of the larger states in mind. So this is very good for large populated states. They would have more representation in the lower house, and then therefore they could choose people that would favor them to make up the upper house. Here's a little visual to help you understand the population at the time. Virginia, big state. Virginia Plan, good for big states. Makes sense, right? On the other hand, we have New Jersey way down here, which is bigger than some states, but definitely not big, right? So they didn't like the Virginia Plan, and they said, not so fast, Virginia. Looked just like that, too. And they wanted to keep a unicameral legislature, which is what the Articles of the Confederation had, where basically every state, the 13 states at the time, just had one vote, and they made decisions that way. This was good for small states. This ensured that the number, obviously good for small states because they would be equal in power to the big states. Excuse me. I'm a little off my game today. I'm tired. I had a long day of tromping on the woods. Anyway, back on track. And if you think about the budget process, equal representation is kind of a big deal because if the big states are that much bigger, and as you saw, they have 4 times the representation as the smaller states, well, they can create that budget to really favor, their needs in their big states. So that's something that the small states were really weary of. So they wanted an equal representation system where each state had a vote. In comes Roger Sherman. Remember that name, Roger Sherman? I should have had it on this slide. I don't. I'll add it later. He was from Connecticut, and this is also called the Connecticut Compromise. So you might want to write all that down, as you should be taking notes as you watch this. Remember, you're not going to remember all that. So the Great Compromise, Connecticut Compromise, called both of those things. Kind of Roger Sherman is known as the creator of this, and he came up with the plan, which is what we now have today. Let's have a bicameral legislature with the House of Representatives based on the population. That gives an advantage to the larger states like Virginia, making Virginia happy. But then have another house called the Senate, which will have equal representation. So small states like New Jersey are happy with the Senate. Big states are happy there. And everybody's happy. So this is truly a great compromise. How about some other compromises? What about that have to do with population? So if we're going to have population matter, because representation in the House of Representation, or the House of Representatives, is going to be reflecting this population of the states. Well, the southern states are like, hey, we got a bunch of people down here, right? I mean, some of them are owned by us, but we got a whole lots of people. We need to have all them people counted so we can have more power. And the northern states We're like, well, we don't believe in slavery, and we're not going to let you have more power just because you partake in this wrong thing that you guys do. So they came up with the 3/5 compromise, where the northern states are like, well, I mean, maybe they could be counted a little, but not like as a full person. So then they decided on 3/5, which is really weird. And it's kind of one of these things in history where it's like, what? And I'm sure you've heard of this before. So basically, 50 slaves would equal 30 people in counting for the population of a state. This is in Article 1, Section 2. We've got the actual text down here. It's kind of tough to understand the way they worded it, but basically you take all the white people, right? And let's say there's 100 white people. And then if there's 30 slaves in that state, you would add on 3/5 of that number to, or let's say 50 slaves. Just keep it easy for me here. You would add on 3/5 of that number to the total population, which would be 30 in this case. And now that state has 130 people. And their representation in the House of Reps will be proportionate to a state with 130 people. That wasn't the only issue surrounding slavery in the North and the South. The Commerce Slave Compromise was also put in there in order to ensure that Southern states would not go against the Constitution. Basically said Congress couldn't act on slavery for 20 years. So it just instilled slavery in the country for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And then after those 20 years were up, the importation of slaves were banned. Not slavery, obviously. That didn't happen until the 14th Amendment, or the 13th Amendment, 13th Amendment, and Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. But this banned new slaves from coming in. So basically, the transatlantic slave trade was over after 1808 by law. Another one is the Fugitive Slave Clause, or the Fugitive Slave Act, which is in Article 4, which says that if somebody runs away up north, states are obligated to return the runaway slaves to their owners. So this is a couple things that made the southern states happy and willing to adapt the Constitution. This is kind of neat. This is like an old campaign sign where they're even referring to like political parties, and so you should pause and read through that. It's kind of fun to see. So once you hammer out all those compromises, you got to put it into action, right? Well, they decided that in the 7th article that 9 of 13 states will be needed to ratify this Constitution in order for it to take effect. And that took a little while. This all happened, remember, in 1787. It wasn't until 1788 in June when the 9th state voted yes, and it became ratified. Eventually, just kind of like for show, all states ratified it. Not until 1790, Rhode Island was the last one. But it only needed 9 to become the law of the land. Therefore, in 1788, it became 9. Or it became ratified. Jeez. A little bit more. Another issue before it was ratified was this concept of central government versus states' rights, or the nationalists versus the states' writers. We'll talk more about this later as we talk about our Federalist and Anti-Federalist learning target. But I just wanted to throw this at you now to get you a little base before we do get into more detail about this. And the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist argument had to deal again with, should we have an all-powerful federal government or more power to the state governments? Obviously, you can't have all power to the state governments because that was wrong in the first place, right? In order to make sure that these anti-federalists adopted the Constitution and voted yes, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison came out with the Federalist Papers, which were a series of essays written to convince a yes vote. And I also want you to know this. Here's a big idea. The way that they got them, aside from just the Federalist Papers, which convinced a lot of people, was they promised to put in the Bill of Rights as soon as it was ratified. This was a huge compromise. That got the anti-federalists to sign on to the Constitution. The Federalists said, we know you're worried about personal liberties, so in order to make up for that, we're going to throw in the Bill of Rights. And that got them to sign on. So I'm about to get kicked off because this can only be 10 minutes. So this was the second video. I will then give a very brief third video explaining your quiz. So make sure you watch that video, which is also attached.